There's a story in Dowse's family that
People were bribing people for votes.
he's an interesting character. He escaped out under hay.
Got him with a swing in the head. He falls down, and then they beat him while he's down.
Yeah, and he dies on the floor.
It sounds absolutely brutal.
Yeah.
All of them.
Whoa. Protestants and Catholics on the island got along pretty good.
Paying off voters with liquor. They saw this person out there in the battle.
By this time, all the Irish Protestants on PEI looked like
Beating people up who didn't vote the way they wanted.
he had 3 ancestors in the riot.
Find any excuse they could just to be like, oh, I couldn't make it.
Yeah, exactly.
Sorry.
But I think the bigger thing was it was a way to fight against the land reform, which was,
Threatening to take away their leases.
and when I say driving them off, they're using sticks to drive them
this
off.
is not, just like
They're not just yelling at them, no.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
Imagine if the decisions you made affected people well over 150 years from now. Imagine a showdown of forces representing vast swaths of the island. Imagine a showdown so brutal that it led to bloodshed and death, killing several and maiming and beating many others. In a civilization that lacked some of the basic institutions to justly rule on the outcomes, leading to broken communities and a deep divide and mum fear that lasted decades. Armed with bludgeons like fence posts and lumber, people fought to the death over the election of a real estate agent representing the Scottish Lord Selkirk, who owned 1/10 of Prince Edward Island, well over 100,000 acres. The agent, William Dowse, was a brewer and hotel owner and tavern owner. He ran a store and was a major importer and exporter. He was a shipbuilder, a commissioned broker, a magistrate for more than 2 decades, a fire warden in Charlottetown, president of the Royal Agriculture Society, and the host of the island's first circus in 1829. But it was his career as a land agent and politician that made him the central figure in a battle that became a secret part of Prince Edward Island history, a dark day that people didn't talk about. Now, 178 years later, a descendant of this bloody battle releases the defining book that tells it all, the Belfast Riot of 1847. Here with me now on the Real PEI podcast, the author, Callum Beck.
thank you. Good introduction.
Thank you. It's true, right? It's more or less accurate.
That's more or less accurate, yeah.
Wow. I mean, though, when we're talking about William Dowse, there's a lot more to the picture. After reading, okay, here's the book here. I'm partway through.
Yeah.
This was quite the time. I mean, to get started, can you walk us through the events of March 1st, 1847?
Yes. Okay, we'll have to go back just a little bit. So the previous August, there was an election in Belfast. And at that time, you've got a pretty serious divide between the Reform Party, which became the Liberal Party, and the Conservative Party. So Dowse represents the Conservative Party. They're the landowners, the established business folk and that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. And the Reform Party is the party that wants to escheat the land or take the land from the landowners and give it to the farmers, effectively. Mm-hmm. And so at that election, the Irish Catholics come out. Now, you have to understand, Dowse is the land agent for Lord Selkirk. This is the second Lord Selkirk. Mm-hmm. So he took over the land in 1833. Dowse is the land agent, and they had put in pretty aggressive land policies, mm-hmm. and policies that were really hurt the landowners. Mm-hmm. Now, it actually hurts the Irish and the Scottish equally, mm-hmm. which was one of the surprising things I learned in my study.
Not what was expected.
Everybody just thought they were targeting the Irish, but they were really just targeting the tenant reform movement. Mm-hmm. And so whoever came in. So they had the big thing that happened in 40, they started 21-year land leases.
Mhm.
And those 21-year leases, people think, well, 21 years, that's pretty long. But if you have to clear the land, build barns, build your house, and then the landowner comes in and says, oh, I like that, I'll take that.
Yeah, you couldn't exactly bring in heavy equipment to clear the land.
No,
either.
no, it's
this
all,
would be.
this is hard labor. Yeah. And so you might get it running as a decent farm in that time, and then you lose it. So that was the concern. So Dowse in Selkirk became the leader in 21-year land leases. They also had pretty difficult terms, and it was really driven, I think it was driven by two things. One might have been a little bit of greed. They thought they could get some money because by that point, the island's getting more populated.
Mhm.
But I think the bigger thing was it was a way to fight against the land reform movement, which was hot as could be in the latter part of the 1830s. But that continues on in the Belfast area. And so the Irish Catholics come out in 1846, effectively to try to stop Dowse from being elected and to get in their candidates. So there's a mixture, because it's not just the Irish who are voting for the reformers, because 75% of the riding is Protestant. Right. So there had to have been a good number of Protestants voting for the Reform Party as well. But they come in, they try to drive off the supporters of Dowse. They use sticks. It was a pretty bad election riot, probably the second or third worst riot on the island.
This is 1846, a year before.
This is the year before. So that election gets contested.
Yeah.
And there's 3 votes on it. All the votes are 11-10. And so they overturn the election, and then you have a by-election on March 1st. So the by-election on March 1st is very significant. It won't completely determine the power in the House, but it will have a big influence on the power in the House. And so the reformers were pretty successful the first time. And when I say driving them off, they're using sticks to drive them off.
Is not, just like
they're not just yelling at them. No. Yeah. So they thought, and they called this muscular persuasion.
Yeah.
So they decided to use some more muscular persuasion in 1847. They come in, the Irish Catholics are very well armed. They're from not just the riding, even from outside of the riding. And when the first group of Scottish Presbyterians come in to vote, they drive them off and beat them pretty bad. The person who gets beaten the worst is Malcolm McRae. And Malcolm McRae is not killed, but he's nearly killed, and he dies later that night.
That day. Yeah. Directly from the wound.
Yes, directly from the wounds, absolutely. And many others are beaten really bad. So, over 20 had pretty severe injuries. Even this is round 1 of the riot.
This is round 1. This is the one that we don't hear about at all.
Well, you hear about parts of both.
Yeah.
But it's important to know that there is 2 parts to the riot, because they're both, they're different. Okay, so round 1, they're trying to drive off Dowse and his supporters. They effectively do that. But because it was so severe, the beatings, then the Scots get together and they start to then send out horse riders all over the area.
Oh, so this is on March 1st. We're March 1st.
This is on March 1st.
Okay, yes. Right, the 2 rounds on March 1st.
Yeah, 2 rounds on March 1st. Yeah. And so they bring in people from all over the riding. They spend a couple hours preparing their sticks. Meanwhile, now this is maybe the most stunning part of it. So McRae has been beaten nearly to death, probably about 20 others, but they resume the election. Yeah. So it's not like they say, oh, this was a pretty big riot, we better stop this and do it again.
It's like, no, I guess this seems fine. We'll just keep going. and for McRae, it was by several accounts, there was 5 people chased him down, got him with a swing in the head. He falls down, and then they beat him while he's down. And then his head is so injured that later that day he dies.
Exactly.
This is brutal.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And he dies on the floor of the manse, the Presbyterian manse. And the minister there, they took in all the wounded. I should say all the wounded on the Scottish side. And the Irish who end up getting wounded go to nearby farmhouses after that. And so
no ambulance coming in there.
No ambulances. So anyway, the election officials, the Irish, then they go in and vote. They keep doing the election. By about 2:30, the Scottish have amassed. They're now ready with their sticks. And there's about 200 Scots and 300 Irish. And they're Scottish Presbyterians and Irish Catholics. There's a couple that don't fit into that category, but very few. The ones who don't fit in that category line up with the religion, not with the ethnicity. Okay. So the first round is very much about the land issue. And not just the land issue, but the land issue as it's comes out in William Douse's face, who they really detest.
Yeah.
Now, I should say one thing about Douse. Douse is actually he's an interesting character. He accomplished a lot, but it's like, these guys who do a lot, they always end up doing a lot of good and a lot of bad.
Yeah.
He was the key guy in bringing the Point Prim Lighthouse, to
people
to exist.
Really respect that. And I mean, you talk later in the book, number of people came out to his funeral, and some of the ways people spoke about him was
very highly regarded.
Very highly. I mean, this is a sophisticated person, no matter what way you look at it. Yeah. And hardworking.
And a hardworking guy.
Yeah.
They built all kinds of ships, did all kinds of things.
Yeah.
But he was also, if you were against him,
that was not a good position.
That was not a good position to be in. Yeah.
Yeah.
And he was a no-nonsense
There'd be a lot of Scottish Catholics who would have sort of played along like, oh yeah, no, you're good, but also felt threatened by him and would just choose not to vote, right?
Absolutely.
So they just they'd find any excuse they could just to be like, oh, I couldn't make it.
Exactly.
Sorry.
Yeah. Because the thing was, if you didn't vote for him,
he'd come after you.
He'd
threaten your release.
Yeah. And then, so he'd say, well, I'm going to collect the rent tomorrow. And all the tenants are behind on their rents.
Right.
So if you threaten to collect the rent the next day, that's a big threat. It's an existential threat.
Right.
Especially
time of year. I mean, it's not exactly right after harvest.
Exactly.
March 1st.
Yeah. But some of them might have been behind in the rent 10 years.
Right.
Yeah. And some of them had actually, in their protests, didn't pay their rent to try to get the Escheat movement. So there was a civil disobedience thing that had happened as well.
Right. Yeah.
And so it very much was a big threat. And Douse, as I mentioned in the book, he uses the intimidation factor of the land agents, which is basically, if you don't vote for me, I'll collect the rent tomorrow. But he also uses the intimidation factor of the less powerful, which is, if you don't vote for me, I'll beat you over the head. Yeah. And Douse challenges people on the hustings to fights. He calls them scoundrels.
Oh, yeah.
You shall eat humble pudding with me yet, and all of this thing. So he's this larger than life, and he was like over 300 pounds. So he's a big character. Yeah. So they drive him off, or they drive the voters off.
His voters, yeah.
His voters off.
Yeah, the Irish Catholic drive off the Scottish Protestants who were going to vote for him.
Exactly. And so then after that happens, they're, like I say, you've got the 300 Irish Catholics on one side of the Buchanan field. This is the Buchanan farm, or what was the Buchanan farm in Belfast. Right close to the Belfast Presbyterian Church. You have 300 on one side of the field, 200 Scottish Presbyterians on the other side.
Who came back organized.
Very organized. Yeah. And the Irish Catholics by that time are probably a little bit drunk because there was always alcohol. The Scots may have been a little bit, but
Yeah, because Douse would give people alcohol after
yes,
voting.
but see, they hadn't had a chance to vote.
Right.
So I just don't think they were as inebriated.
Yeah, and when you factor in even just the raw numbers, the Scots were down. They had 200 to 300 roughly.
Yeah.
But they were organized and not drunk.
And I think that's the key thing. Plus, some of them, especially the big strong men, use what they called longers, and those are the rail fences. So they're just like probably 6 or 8 foot poles. And if you can wield that, you're a dangerous force.
Yeah, and they're long. You talked in the book about how those longer weapons were a big advantage for the Scottish, and the Irish preferred
they had more shillelaghs and
which is
sleigh
almost like
sticks.
A walking stick type
More
of thing,
like
right?
a walking stick with a knob on the end.
But they would have like nails and screws in them too, right?
Well, some might. You don't hear much reference to nails and screws.
Okay, yeah. So it's mostly wood.
Mostly wood. Now they would have used sleigh sticks as well, just because they all came in their sleighs, and other sticks they would have prepared. And so the election prepared, absolutely prepared. They came totally prepared.
Like there was it some of the Scottish, or was it Douse that brought some under hay in a? I'm trying to remember that reference in the book.
So there's a story in Douse's family that he escaped out under hay.
Right.
Because he's the target and he's behind the hustings, and they're trying to protect Douse.
Hustings are where people vote. And also where, and it was open voting.
Open voting.
And the politicians would go up and basically say their stump speeches, right?
Exactly.
And they'd try to convince people to vote for them verbally in person.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it's back and forth.
So the amount of so they would know who was voting for who very much.
Absolutely.
And they would openly reward and bribe and punish.
Absolutely. Yeah. And the open vote goes, I think, right up to 1912.
Whoa.
Yeah. So it was because they called it a manly way of voting, you know?
Right, to get it.
Yeah.
Yeah, you had to stand up for what you were voting.
Exactly.
Yeah, I can almost see there being a positive spin on that.
Yeah.
In a way.
Yeah.
But now that I know how that played out, I wouldn't suggest.
No, I wouldn't go back to
it. Whoa. Okay. Yeah. So we got this standoff happening here.
The election officials try to get in between them and stop what they can tell is going to be an awful riot.
Yeah, and they try to recruit people to work as essentially guards, right, on the spot.
Yeah, basically they appointed people to try to maintain the peace. But there's
everybody's got skin in the game.
Yeah, and everybody
knows each other.
Exactly. Too. Well, they won't necessarily all know each other.
I guess a lot of the Irish, like coming up from Monaghan Road and stuff, wouldn't necessarily know. I mean, that's quite a distance if you're traveling on a horse.
Quite a distance, yeah.
Coming by horse.
Yeah. And so there would be a lot of people you wouldn't know. In fact, they weren't able to identify exactly who beat McRae. They thought it was, certain people, but they weren't able to 100% identify them.
And I do wonder, based on that, how much they just didn't want to.
No, Douse definitely wanted
to. But he tried. He put names forward.
He did put name forward. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, O'Donnell or something?
There was Patrick Clarkin and O'Connell.
Yeah, right.
No, I always get the names.
There's so many names and so many dates. But okay, yeah. So
they get there. They try to keep them apart. One of them gets beaten, gets hit themselves. And
one of the people trying to keep them
apart. And all the election officials leave. So it's 2:30 in the afternoon. They're gone.
This is just 2:30 in the afternoon because the election only started at 11:30 a.m. or something like that. And then exactly. the first chasing off of McRae was at 12:15, right?
Yeah.
Ish.
Yeah, in that area.
So that all happened pretty quick.
Yeah.
And then they got people right away.
Yeah. And they bring them in. And that's when the main battle happens. And kind of what I explain in the book is the first round is probably about Douse and the land issue. But by the time you get to the second round, nobody's voting after that. The election is now done.
Yeah.
And it really, people resort to their tribal loyalties. And it's very much Irish Catholic versus Scottish Presbyterian. And the Scots are very well organized. They're in 3 lines, and they've got right and left flanks, and they move as a group, and they lay out. They figure they laid out about 70 Irish on the field. When that happened, one of the Scots
I laid out. What do you mean?
Well, hit with sticks over the head. They're bleeding. They're lying in the field.
We're talking broken bones,
broken arms,
badly injured, and some dead.
Yeah, and some dead. And so they're lying in the field. The one of the reports from a person at the time, because there's snow on the ground, they said the field was like a bunch of butchers had been at work, killing cattle.
And describing the sounds, what they say, boats against the dock.
Yeah, like when you hit the sledges against those against the boats to free the boats, Yeah. It was just this,
clanging and thumping.
Yeah.
And it seemed that was, we don't have video of this.
No.
And it sounds absolutely brutal. And I don't think there were a lot of bystanders. Right? Because if you were there, you were either attacking or defending, or you were the heck out of there.
Yeah.
And so there's not as much and not as detail of description of who hit who, and it's more of it's just a crazy.
Yeah, and I think a lot of the reason there's not the detail was, very soon after the riot, it just starts to get covered over.
Yeah. So nobody wants to talk about it.
Yeah. Now, if they'll talk about it in their own groups.
Yeah.
But it's not being talked about public.
Yeah.
And of course, part of the reason that would be to protect yourself against being prosecuted and that kind of thing. But it was just an overwhelming traumatic event as well. And so I think that's a bigger part of why they stopped talking about it. So anyway, they're laying each other out in the field. One of the little tragic stories, this comes from Cantelou's. This Cantelow fella had all kinds of great stories from it, and he had 3 ancestors in the riot. But I don't know if it was his grandfather or great-grandfather, but he was 17 years old. And apparently the Scots had the teenagers in the 3rd line. So they weren't in the battle, but when the people were on the ground, they would go in and finish them off. So they're laying on the ground, and he had 2 other ancestors who were on the wings.
You're carrying that memory.
And he said I can't remember, it's grandfather or great-grandfather, I forget which. He said he never talked about it. And he felt it was probably because he thought he had killed someone. But the others did talk about it because they were just part of the battle.
Right.
Yeah. But, to go in and hit someone. So there's a real possibility that the teenage Scottish boys killed the teenage Irish boys who were probably lying on the ground wounded before they were finished off. Which, we don't know that for sure, but that's a reasonable possibility.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it was very tragic that way.
Yeah. And when you think about the way, maybe talk just like what happened for the next decades after this, because that's kind of that ended up having a huge impact on culture.
Yeah.
On PEI for many years.
And it wasn't until I had done the work on it that we kind of realized how great an impact it had. So this part of the history, like if you go into the older history books, it's not really written about, but we had terrible education wars from 1856 to 1877. And that was over funding of St. Dunstan's. Separate schools would have been the biggest issue. There was also a thing known as the Bible question, whether you have Bible in the public school system.
And of course, it was the Catholics who didn't want it in there.
The Catholics didn't want it because the Catholics didn't want the Protestants interpreting the Bible, the Protestant teachers, right?
Mhm.
And you had to have a priest to interpret the scriptures. So those three issues deeply divided the island. And, like I say in the book, we had three elections that were completely determined by Catholics voting for Catholics and Protestants voting for Protestants. And it's the hottest issue in that period, more than Confederation, more than the railway, more than the land question even. Now all of these things will flare up and become the main issue for a short period of time. But through the whole period, these underlying sectarian education issues, that's the main thing. And the island at that point is just deeply, deeply divided between Protestants and Catholics.
And nervous.
Nervous.
Each other.
Oh, yeah. Oh,
and
totally.
they'd also, like, when you think about it, and imagine that someone who was there, who knew, they saw this person out there on the battlefield. They saw them, like, or the riot or whatever you want to call it. But this reminds me, it's almost like a scene from Braveheart with sticks or something. Yeah. But like, it's like, you can imagine seeing someone there. And then if you're in the dark of night and you see that person, and also if there's not necessarily the institutions in place to have any kind of accountability for this. And so you can imagine being like, I am steering clear of each other. And I don't want to risk facing what the other person might think is justice from this.
Yeah.
Like,
it is. There's a lot of fear. There's a lot of kind of staying with your own group, and keeping at a safe distance. And there's a lot of negative things said about each on the other side, especially in the political context. But anyway, that stuff never really came out until the 1970s and 1980s about the education issues.
Right. So it wasn't talked about?
No. There's a history of education done by, I think it's Anderson at Prince of Wales. He spends 2 sentences on that topic so he does a whole history of education, and he has 2 sentences on that topic.
Whoa.
So it was covered over.
Yeah.
Anyway, that comes out with some of the scholarly research. Ian Ross Robertson would have been the main person who did that, but there were others. And but even Robertson saw no connection between that and the Belfast Riot.
Right.
So it was kind of like the Belfast Riot happened and it was terrible, but it had no impact. So then what I did, and I did with my students, is we studied all the newspapers from 1847 to 1856. And we realized, like, as soon as the riot ends, this sectarian division between Protestant and Catholic starts. It's immediate. And there within a couple of weeks, there's people going around saying, vote for this person, he's a Protestant, or vote for this person, he's a Catholic. Just within a couple of weeks of the end of that. That had not happened before. Okay, we didn't, like, Protestants and Catholics on the island got along pretty good up till 1847. But in 1847, it all changes. So I trace that whole history out, and you just see that this division is very deep as soon as the Belfast Riot hits. When the education wars hit in 1856, that just adds further fuel to the fire and makes it even worse.
So I think 30 years later, there's another riot.
Yeah.
That one is dealt with more soundly, right? So can you talk about that a little bit and maybe how that was a turning point?
Yeah. So the Orange Day riot happens in 1877. Now, 2 things happen in July of 1877. One, there was an election in 1876, which is over separate schools. So we end up with a free school system. Everybody can go to whatever school they want to. But the Premier and Bishop McIntyre meet, and they make a backroom deal. So basically, McIntyre says, you can use our schools in the public system as long as they're staffed completely by Catholics and they're for Catholic students. So there, you end up with officially a non-separate school system, but unofficially a separate school system.
Mm-hmm.
And so when I grew up in Charlottetown,
Mm-hmm.
you know, I'm halfway between St. Jean and West Kent. And if you know anyone over 70, I'm Protestant. So you know anyone over 70, you just say, what school did he go to? Everyone would say he went to West Kent because that's where the Protestants went.
Right.
And that's right up until 1967.
Wow.
And that started in 1877. Now, the good thing about those gentlemen's agreements.
Whoa, that's 100 years.
Yeah, exactly.
Dude.
And this goes in the political field. It's in just about every level of PEI society. So some people don't know this, but every election we elected 21 Protestants and 9 Catholics. Now, I don't mean we usually elected them. I mean every election.
Every election
was 21 to 9. And then there would be 3 Catholics who were in the cabinet and 6 Protestants. And so they had all of these things. And federally, we elected 3 Protestants and 1 Catholic. The Catholic would always be in Kings County. Because they would run you would run a Catholic against a Catholic in Kings County and Protestant against Protestant in the other 3 counties. And so they had all of these.
It was sort of accepted.
Oh yeah, it was very much accepted. You didn't break those conventions because that was the way you kept the peace. Okay?
Right.
And the Catholics were relatively okay with it because they were at least guaranteed a portion of the pie. Okay? It was always a small, the Protestants are in power. You know, they're the main leaders. But the Catholics at least have a portion of the pie. And so without that, you might end up with nothing. So you accept your kind of secondary status because you're doing okay. Plus, you're free to live your religious life freely.
Yeah.
You know, you're not being oppressed and things like that. So this was set up. So that gets settled in July. And the other thing that happens is on July 12th, there's an Orange Day parade. They come back from the Orangemen, who are our Protestant order.
Yep. Pretty
aggressive Protestant order. So the riots, any riot that happens in New Brunswick or in Ontario, is the Orangemen are always part of it. Okay.
Right.
So it's kind of the orange versus the green with the Irish Catholic. And but the Orangemen were very significant on the island. They start now this is an interesting thing. The first Orange Lodge is in 1851 in Charlottetown, just 4 years after. Now, you have to understand, the Orange Lodge is Irish Protestant.
Irish Protestant.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
Okay. We don't have hardly any Irish Protestants. By this time, all the Irish Protestants on PEI look like English Protestants. Okay.
Right.
And they're part of the elite.
Right.
So they're not the ones starting the Orange Lodge. The Orange Lodge start among Scottish Protestants. Same thing happens in Newfoundland as well.
Oh.
But the first Orange Lodge is in Belfast.
Oh, really?
Yeah. And then there's
not coincidentally, probably
not coincidentally at all.
They're like, let's get into the action here.
Well, they're seeing it as a defensive because they feel so threatened by the Catholics. So this is the organization that's going to defend them from the Catholic aggressor.
Okay, got it.
Okay.
Yeah.
And you end up having 3 of the first 4 lodges on the island are in the wider Belfast area. And that's not coincidence. That's because that's where the divide and the intensity of the divide is the strongest because of what had happened in the riot. So, but anyway, you have the Orange Lodge gets established and they have their annual meeting in Rocky Point. They come back on the ferry and they're met by a group of Irish Catholics. The Orangemen had a building, I think at the bottom of Queen Street. And so anyway, the Irish Catholic, they were paving the street. So the Irish Catholic, they're throwing paving stones at the Orangemen. And actually a few of them get shot at. And so they have to go into their building. A few of them get wounded with the bullets. Nobody dies. So the next day they decide, well, this war is going to continue. And so they said the next day was a great day for gun sales in Charlottetown. But the governing officials, essentially what they did is they said, no, we're not letting this happen. So I think maybe it was 200 constables or something that they appointed that day, and special constables, and they went out in the streets. And if you were looked at all like you were going to be involved in this, they just arrested you and put you in jail right away. And
so it was almost martial law they instituted.
For that day.
For that day.
Yeah. And very much so. They just went out. There was no, like, we're shutting this down. And it likely would have been worse because the guns would have been involved. And you could have had a lot of deaths in that. And what happens with that, because the governing authorities stepped in, made sure there was peace, and in this case was very balanced how they approached it, then both sides feel relatively safe. And so that, in combining with the school issues being settled, is really what ends the sectarian wars. So from 1877 until the 1960s, we have very few battles. Now, that doesn't mean there's not an Irish teenage boy and a Protestant teenage boy. They get in fights, whatever. But there would be Irish fighting Irish and Protestants fighting Protestants too, right? Yeah. But there's just nothing like what we had in that 30-year period. Yeah. But there's also not a deep intimacy. Yeah. The big issue through that time is dating. And so the Catholics want to make sure their kids date only Catholics, and the Protestants want to make sure their kids date only Protestants.
I dare say there's probably still some of that.
There might be a little bit of that. Yeah. It'd be minor.
Residual.
Exactly. Yeah, there'd be a few residual effects. But and the Protestants and Catholics were equally strong on that. And occasionally you would have some intermarriages, and there's tragic stories around that, where, someone marries someone from the other side, and, they get disowned by the family for the next 30 or 40 years, and just some deeply sad stories.
Romeo and Juliet.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Okay, so I have a couple specific things here that I thought would be interesting to lean into. I mean, okay, Selkirk Estate. This thing was huge. Yeah. So a tenth of the island, but even the biggest, right? There was one who had more.
Samuel Cunard was the biggest.
So we had. So there's these. So this was the second Lord Selkirk, and he took over these lots from his father.
Yeah.
And was he ever on PEI?
Just the father was.
The father was, but the son.
And
wasn't.
The father only briefly. When the first settlement came in 1803, the father was there. He came,
and he brought people with him, because that was a big part of what happened. Yes. Right? Like they were bringing over Scottish people, so probably some of the vote for Selkirk, they would have probably this connection of, this is the person who brought me here.
Oh, absolutely.
Right. So even though there would be a lot of mischief and some harshness, there was also that connection.
Yeah, very much so. Now, the interesting thing, and this, as I got into the story deeper, I realized a lot of the Scottish Protestants were opposed to Douse. More Douse than Selkirk. And the point you make is exactly the reason why. I'll just go back a little bit. The most successful settlement on the island is the Belfast settlement.
Well, there's good land out there, for one.
Good land.
Farmland's good.
Yeah. But Selkirk settled it right. He did everything right. He provided enough support, but not too much support.
Right.
Because he said, if you give people too much support and they lean on you, kind of like a welfare situation, they will eventually resent you and they will leave.
What kind of support did he give?
Just like tools,
so enough help equip people.
Yeah,
help bring over boatloads of equipment and that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I don't know if it was boatloads of equipment, but enough that people could go out and build their own houses.
Yeah,
and get themselves established. Plus, he allowed them, if anyone wanted to buy the land, he would sell the land at good prices.
Yeah,
and so
good, not as good as he got, but I mean, that was. I mean, he got it for a song. So
yeah.
I mean, I guess all those numbers seem like they're for a song now.
Well, exactly.
Yeah. Actually, I have some of the numbers here. So Selkirk Estate originally purchased the land for £3,000.
Yeah.
All of the land. Whoa. Which breaks down to about 3.5 pence per acre. There are 240 pence in a pound.
Yeah.
This is not necessarily exact. Then they leased the land to tenants for 1 shilling per acre. There are 12 pence in a shilling. So 1 shilling equals 12 pence. That means they paid 3.5 pence per acre and rented out for 12 pence per acre per year. So they bought it for 3.5 pence and the annual rent was 12.
Okay.
This is just based on if the numbers from the book kind of broke it. I did a little bit of, so hopefully this is accurate.
Well, your research on it would be better than mine.
Well, it's based on the information that you provided in the book, but I tried to kind of break down the numbers a bit. But I'm not used to dealing with pounds and pences and things like that, so I might have it messed up. But this is, if I have it right. So if they sold the land later, the sale price per acre was more than 60 times what they paid for it. Now, granted, well, that's a great return. However, they got it for, I don't think it was so much about the money, maybe. I'm not exactly sure.
No, I would say the initial Selkirk, he was part of the Enlightenment, Scottish Enlightenment. And he really had a big theory about immigration and how to make immigration effective.
Yeah.
And
well, he certainly did a lot of it. I mean,
he did.
Pretty wild.
Yeah. And he was much more. He eventually goes to Manitoba.
Boats and just the whole everything is so different. It's hard to get my head around.
Oh yeah. It's very. They come over on 3 different boats. Now there were 500 Protestants and they'd be all Presbyterian, of course, and 300 Scottish Catholics. But he separated the Protestants and the Catholics.
Yeah.
So the Catholics went closer to Montague area.
Yeah.
Lots 53 and 59. And he kept the Presbyterians in the 4, what I call Selkirk blocks, 57, 58, 60, and 62, which is roughly Wood Islands to Belfast. Oh, a little bit north of Belfast.
Yeah, maybe almost up to... Not up to like Earnscliffe.
Yeah, up to say Orwell, something like that. Yeah. And he did that because he said, life is so difficult, in a pioneer settlement, that you don't want to have divisions, you know. So if you have a united people, then you're much more likely to have a successful settlement.
Yeah.
And I think there's a lot of truth in that.
And they wouldn't exactly, if you're between Montague and Belfast, that's a stretch if you don't have a car.
Oh, it's a long, and of course they wouldn't have good roads.
Yeah.
Anything like that.
Yeah.
So that was part of it.
They'd be traveling some of the old Roma roads at that point, right?
There would be some, a little bit of pass through the woods,
Yeah.
But there wasn't it.
And they'd be going horseback, would they?
There'd be a little horseback. A lot of traveling by foot initially.
Traveling by foot that far?
But eventually, one of the things...
I guess you could do a trek like that in a day or two.
Yeah. A dose will eventually help to get some roads developed in the area too. Yeah. So, you do eventually start to get some infrastructure into the whole situation. But anyway, so that's what he did. He made sure... So I think by the next year or the next 2 years... They're completely independent of Selkirk. They're a well-established, independent community. Angus Macaulay, who was the doctor, he was really helpful in keeping the community successful at the beginning as well. And so it became a great community. When the second Selkirk comes in 1833, he never comes to the island. But the people remember what the first Selkirk did for them. And so that's part of the reason a lot of the Scots would continue to vote for the land agent. It's not so much that Scots loved Dowse, but they had such a fondness for the initial Selkirk.
Right.
Because he was so good to them. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, well, just being that things were, I mean, we kind of talked about this, but things were kind of, they seem so unhinged at like back then.
Yeah.
So people were bribing people for votes, threatening to take away their leases, beating people up who didn't vote the way they wanted, politicians showing up to their speeches drunk, paying off voters with liquor. I mean, this would make quite a series, right? Don't you think this could be an incredible series?
Oh, yes. Yeah.
It's pretty wild. One thing very relevant to kind of real estate on PEI. So we're doing, you know, we as realtors were always dealing with Iraq and the lands, the rules on how lands can be sold and that kind of stuff, especially when you're dealing with over 5 acres or over 165 feet of waterfront, or over a certain amount of total acres. There's just a variety of rules, and we're sending things off through IRAC to the general council to decide on who can buy what and things like that. And from my understanding, it's some of these current rules are actually sort of tie directly back into some of this history with the escheat movement and trying to, you know, move away from having the absentee landlords and everything. Do you have any familiarity with how this all plays into the way things are governed now?
I don't really have much on that.
Yeah. No,
I think there's probably a worthwhile study in there.
Well, there is, because I know that we were like a couple of years ago, Island Regulatory Appeals Commission did a presentation for all the realtors on PEI. And they kind of, you know, date back some of their current rules to around this time. And so it's like, wow, it's just the way this all connects is pretty wild. One of the other things in this book is that so many of the names. So I went I grew up just outside of Montague. And my mom's side of the family was from down around there. Protestants, Scottish Protestants. And then my dad's, if you go back, especially on his mother's side, they were Catholics who had a shipbuilding operation down at Brudenell Point across from Georgetown.
Okay.
And so Andrew Archibald MacDonald was my dad's however many grandfather's brother. And the two brothers had the shipbuilding operation on what's now called Roma Point, but it was kind of a, you know, out across from Georgetown, basically. But anyway, he ended up in Charlottetown. My mom kind of moved him back and made him Protestant. But when you go through this book, so many of the names are last names of people I went to high school with. And so it's like, I mean, Belfast feeds into Montague High, as you're well aware, I'm sure. But also just, I mean, I have a lot of connections to down there. I was in the band Paper Lions. So Colin Buchanan, Alan Buchanan's son. I was in a band with Colin for many years. I mean, we're still kind of in a band.
And just a reminder, that's the farm that the riot took place on.
The riot took place on their farm. So I'd be hearing about this all the time. And the band Paper Lions, everybody but me, in terms of the core members, were from Belfast. Even Bruce Rooney, who toured with us a lot, he's also from Belfast. And so people generally assumed I was from Belfast. So I'd always be talking to people who had some kind of connection to Belfast to be telling me about it. And the Belfast Riot would keep coming up. Now, when I'd heard about it, people would normally say one person died.
Oh, interesting.
But I don't know if that's just coincidental. They'll be like, you know, someone died. That's the lot I hear here. But
and let me just clarify that
part
point.
Of what drew me in. That's like, I saw your book launch was coming up, and I've heard about this for so long. I'm like, I got to go. It was way more. There's way more going on there than I was anticipating.
And so at least 3 died, but there's also a very strong tradition of secret burials, and the Irish secretly burying some of their dead. And everybody kind of thinks, well, why would you do secret burials? Of course, today we have such a victim mentality, you know. So if we lost the war, well, we'd be just big victims and we'd be overstating how terrible the other side was and all the terrible things they did to us, right? But back then,
they were ashamed they lost.
They were ashamed they lost. Totally ashamed. So So there was, right from the get-go, there was a very strong tradition of secret burials. And we know for sure there were secret burials among the Irish in, I think it's an 1849 riot in St. John, New Brunswick.
Mm-hmm.
So there's certainly a possibility that there were a lot more than just the 3 killed.
Mm-hmm.
But we can't say that for sure.
Mm-hmm.
We have never proven that.
I don't know.
Yeah.
You can't. I mean, there would be bits of evidence somewhere, right? Like how much, when you're studying this kind of stuff, can you get from just conversations with people who knew someone who knew someone who knew someone? Like, is that part of when you're doing this research?
Yeah, I did a lot of oral research. You know, I mean, everyone I talked to from the area, I would ask, you know, what do you remember? The interesting thing is the vast majority of people knew very little.
Mm-hmm.
So I did a talk at Orwell Corner in 2010, and many people from the area came. And so I would say to them, you know, why did they come? And they said, well, we always heard about it, but we knew so little about what happened. And the general rule of thumb is most families had one tradition, and that would be all that would come down in their family.
Right.
But the kids, of course, the kids were always interested. And the parents, you know, so the kids would be asking the parents, well, what happened? What happened? And the parents would say, like, well, no, don't be at that.
Right.
And that was the typical response. So there was just no, like, this has to stay buried because we don't want to bring up those
demons.
Those demons again.
Yeah, because I mean, there's risk. If you go back far enough, there's risk of accountability, but there's also shame and just heartache.
Yeah.
Wow. There's a lot to cover here, and I guess for anybody interested, this is the cover of the book, the Belfast Riot of 1847. I definitely recommend it. If, like, I guess you can buy this at any store.
Yeah, Bookmark. I think Indigo sells it as well.
Yeah.
And
And if people want to reach out to you for conversation, is there
yes.
a way of getting
So
a hold of
the
you?
best way to get a hold of me is just through my UPEI email.
Cool.
And especially if you have any traditions. So my email is just cabeck@upei.ca. And, you know, so if you have any traditions, yeah, definitely
and
pass
then
them on.
What about you? Like, do you feel, because your family, like, I know, you know, some people in your family, like my parents grew up next to, I grew up next to Jock and Gwen Beck's cottage, and Cam Beck sold the lot next door to my parents, and many Beck connections.
Yes.
But so your connection back to this, like, what's it like researching this? Like, do you contextualize it through yourself?
The interesting thing about it,
on this?
Like, so how I got into this is I did my thesis on Protestant Catholic relations on PEI. I did my doctoral research on that. And that would be like 2004 to 2010. And I always assumed, I knew about the Belfast Riot, not much. And I assumed I would just do a 2-page summary of it and then move on. But then as I started to study it, I just realized more and more this was a very significant issue. And essentially, I think what happens with historians is you get one question and you try to answer that question. And then that leads to 2 more questions. And then you try to answer, and it just expands. So I ended up in my thesis writing, over a third of my thesis was just on the riot. And I had to cut significant portions out.
Yeah.
But I kept everything and then did further research on it. But it wasn't, I had no personal connection to it until many years later. My grandmother, she was a Martin, but her ancestors were Bruces. And so I'm reading a little bit on our Bruce ancestry, and it's my grandmother. This would be, you know, Jock's grandmother and that kind of thing as well. And she's the source of the information, and she's telling the story about her 2 ancestors who are Bruces who were involved in the Belfast Riot.
Right.
And one who had an injury for the rest of his life.
Wow.
But the only person in the Beck family who would know that story would have been my grandmother. Now, she might have told Aunt Beebe as well, but nobody, like, I talked to my family, nobody had heard of the Belfast Riot.
Right.
And I knew just a little bit about it, but nothing significant.
Yeah.
And so it wasn't where the Protestant Catholic study was very personal, because I grew up at the tail end of that divide. I was at Queen Charlotte in grade 7 when they integrated the schools.
Okay.
And my father was a big part of the uniting of the two universities and that kind of thing. So I had, that part was personal, but the Belfast Riot really had no personal connection. It was just strictly, to me, an interesting and important episode in PEI
it's
history.
pretty neat for me as an agent to hear these stories about Douse too. I mean, that would have been quite the deal. I'm being like, okay, I got Lord Selkirk as my client. Like, yeah. All of a sudden, I've got I've got 1/10 of the island as a book of business. Like that'd be. And all the things, I mean, there's just so much going on there, and all the context so different. So I definitely recommend anyone checking it out. Anyway, thank you so much. Now,
I should just mention one thing that'll be interest to your readers.
Yeah.
I do have an appendix on the landlordism. So essentially, we always think of it as absentee landlords.
Right.
It wasn't so much that they were absentee, it's that a few people owned so much land, and some of them had pretty bad policies, not all of them. And so I have a whole appendix, and actually several appendix related to that landlord issue. So particularly for your real estate people, that will be an interesting little history. Especially now, there's more stuff done on this. Again, Ian Ross Robertson has done some excellent stuff on the Tenant League, but that's 1860s. And so mine is focused on this movement in the 1830s. Rusty Bitterman has done a whole bunch of work on that as well.
Right.
But anyway, you'll find that part interesting.
Like you go through this, even just the names of people, you're driving down the roads and they're named after these people. And stuff.
Exactly.
And it's just like, it's just so interesting to peer back into that time. So thank you for helping illuminate this time for us and documenting it in this form. So thanks for coming on the podcast.
No problem. Thank you for having me.